Wyoming Territory, March 1882. The knock came just after dusk, sharp and quick against the wooden door of the small ranch house nestled in the foothills west of Laramie. Victor Garrison had just finished washing the trail dust off his hands in the basin when it came again, 3 steady raps this time. He moved toward the door with a quiet sense of caution. Folks did not usually travel this far up without reason. When he opened it, the cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and snow, and something else, fear. A young woman stood on his porch, her coat thin, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Her hair was wind-tangled, her boots caked with mud, and beneath her long coat, her belly rounded out, unmistakably full with child. I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I did not know where else to go." Victor stared for a breath too long. Her eyes were wide and brown, rimmed red from crying. She looked like she had not slept in days. She looked like she had not been safe in weeks. "I've been waiting for you my whole life," Victor said softly, not even sure why those words rose out of him. But they were true. Somewhere deep in his chest, he felt it, like something had finally arrived that he had not known he was missing. The woman blinked, startled. He stepped aside. "Come in, please." She hesitated only a second before stepping in. Victor shut the door behind her, bolting it. The fire crackled in the hearth. He grabbed a blanket from the back of the chair and draped it over her shoulders. "I am Victor Garrison. This is my place." She nodded slowly. "I am Lucinda Oakes." He offered her a seat near the fire, and she sank into it with a tired sigh, her hands resting on her belly. She looked like she was about to fall apart, but holding herself together for the baby's sake. "You hungry?" he asked gently. "Got stew?" Lucinda nodded, too weary to speak. Victor ladled a bowl full and handed it to her. She took it with quiet thanks, eating slow and careful, like her stomach was not used to kindness. He did not ask questions right away. He just sat in the chair across from her, hands resting on his knees, watching the firelight flicker against the floorboards. When her bowl was empty and her shoulders had dropped a little from the weight of exhaustion, he finally spoke. "You running from someone?" Lucinda's throat worked as she swallowed, then nodded. "My uncle. After my father died, he took me in. I thought I was safe. But months passed and he sold me off like cattle to a man twice my age. The man got me with child and then left. My uncle planned to sell me again once I gave birth." Victor's jaw clenched, but he kept still, his voice calm. "How far along are you?" 8 months. "You rode up here alone?" "No. I walked. Caught rides on wagons where I could. Stayed with a kind family a few nights near Cheyenne. But I could not stay long. They were worried someone might come looking." Victor nodded slowly. "You are safe here. Nobody comes this far up the ridge without meaning to. And I do not sell people." Something passed between them in that moment, trust, small and unsure, but there. Lucinda's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." He stood and stoked the fire. "You can sleep in my room. I will take the cot out here. I do not want to trouble." "It is no trouble," he said firmly, then softened. "You need the bed more than I do." Lucinda rose slowly, cradling her belly with one hand. She paused in the doorway of the bedroom, turning to look at him. "Why did you say that? At the door? That you have been waiting for me your whole life?" Victor met her eyes. "Because it felt true." Lucinda said nothing, but she did not look away either. The days that followed moved slow. March snow came heavy one night, and the world outside turned white and still. Lucinda stayed in the house, resting, her cheeks regaining color, her hands less shaky as Victor showed her how to heat water on the stove, how to mend a torn shirt. He never asked more than she offered. He never touched her without asking first. And every day, Lucinda watched him, how he moved through the house with quiet strength, how he chopped wood with clean swings, how he spoke gently to the old mare in the barn. One morning, she sat near the window, sewing a button onto one of Victor's shirts. He stepped in from the cold, snow dusting his hat. "You sew real neat," he said as he hung his coat. She smiled. "My mother taught me before she passed." Victor nodded, setting his gloves down. "You remind me of her. She was kind, steady, never raised her voice, but you always listened when she spoke." Lucinda's smile faded, her fingers pausing on the thread. "I have not felt steady in a long time." "You will," he said quietly. "You already are more than you know." Late that week, Lucinda woke in the dark, gasping. Her hand went to her belly, and she felt the tight pull of pain. Not sharp yet, but something had shifted. Victor was already at her side, as if he had heard her through the walls. "Is it time?" he asked, crouching beside the bed. I do not know. I think so." He helped her sit up, then fetched warm water, blankets, everything he had ready just in case. He had no midwife, no womenfolk out this far, but he had delivered calves and read everything he could find after Lucinda arrived. The pain came stronger by dawn. Lucinda gripped his hand through each wave, her face pale and wet with sweat. Victor whispered to her, steady and calm, wiping her brow, holding her when she needed to cry. "It hurts," she said, lips trembling. "I know," he said, pressing her hand to his chest. "But you are not alone." It was near noon when the baby came, a boy, red-faced and wailing. Victor wrapped him in a soft quilt and placed him gently in Lucinda's arms. She stared at the child, her whole body shaking. "You did it," Victor said, voice thick. "He is here. He is perfect." Lucinda looked up at him, her face full of something raw and wide, fear and joy and relief all tangled together. "I do not know how to be a mother." "You already are one," Victor said, "and you will be a good one." Lucinda's eyes filled. "I did not think I would live to see him. I did not think anyone would care if I did." Victor sat beside her, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "I care. I care more than I know how to explain." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. The baby stirred in her arms, and she looked down, her heart already breaking open. "What will you call him?" Victor asked. Lucinda looked at the child, then at Victor. "Bennett." Victor smiled, then kissed her forehead, soft and slow. "We are going to be all right," he said. Lucinda nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. For the first time in her life, she believed it. By mid-April, the snow had thinned to patches clinging stubbornly in the shade, and the ground gave underfoot with the soft rot of thaw. Victor had started planting, turning soil with quiet focus while Lucinda watched from the porch, the baby swaddled against her chest. She didn't speak much that week, and he didn't press her, but her eyes followed him steadily, like she was measuring the shape of her future. One morning, she stepped down the porch steps and crossed the yard to where he knelt beside the garden bed, sleeves rolled, hands dark with earth. "I want to help," she said, adjusting the sling that held Bennett close. "I don't want to sit still anymore." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "So don't." Lucinda crouched beside him, careful not to disturb the baby, and took the trowel he offered. "Tell me what to do," she said. Victor leaned back on his heels, studying her face. "You sure you're up to it?" She nodded. "I need to feel useful again." He pointed to the row he'd marked with twine. "Start there. Press the seeds in 2-finger lengths apart. Gentle, like you're tucking them in." Lucinda smiled faintly. "That I can manage." They worked in silence for a while, the wind soft against their necks, the earth warming under the sun. Bennett stirred but didn't wake, his breath warm against her collarbone. Victor glanced over once. You were always meant to be here, Lucinda. It's in the way you move. Like you belong. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers moved over the soil, precise and sure. I used to think I wasn't built for anything lasting, that I'd be passed from place to place till I faded out somewhere. Victor reached for the seed sack, his hand brushing hers. You're not going anywhere now. She didn't pull away. Have you ever had someone stay? He shook his head. Not like this. Lucinda looked up at him. Me neither. That night, she stood beside the fire, rocking Bennett gently as Victor read aloud from a dog-eared volume of Whitman he'd kept since Kansas. His voice was steady, low, the cadence of the words curling warm around the walls. Lucinda watched him over the baby's head. Did you always read poetry? He glanced up. My mother taught me before I could write my own name. Said men ought to know the shape of words if they want to understand the shape of the world. Lucinda lowered herself slowly onto the chair across from him. She sounds like someone worth remembering. She was, he said. She kept bees. Could tell the weather better than any barometer. People in town called her strange, but she told me the land doesn't give a damn what people think. It gives what it gives, and you take it with gratitude. Bennett stirred again, and Victor leaned forward, holding out his arms. May I? Lucinda hesitated, then nodded, easing the baby into his hands. Victor cradled the child with quiet awe, his large fingers gentle against the small wriggling body. He knows your voice, Lucinda said. Victor didn't answer right away. He rocked slowly, his face unreadable. I hope he'll know my steadiness too. If I've got anything to offer, it's that. Lucinda leaned back, her eyes soft. That's more than most men ever give. Victor looked up. Would you stay if I asked you to? Not just through spring. For good. Lucinda's breath caught, but not from surprise. She had known this question was close. Would you want a woman with a past? One who didn't come clean into your life but arrived broken. I don't want clean, he said. I want real. I want you. Lucinda looked at the fire, then back at him. Then yes, I'll stay. Victor smiled then, not wide, but deep. The kind of smile that settled in his eyes and didn't fade. Lucinda rose and crossed to him. She rested her hand over his where he held Bennett, and the three of them sat together in the hush of the evening, the firelight casting long, slow shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wild grass and thawed earth, the kind of air that meant life was beginning again. By May, the boy had started to coo. Not often, and not loud, but enough that Lucinda would stop mid-motion and watch his mouth move. That tiny sound like a question forming. She'd respond with a hum, sometimes a word, sometimes just her eyes. Victor watched her do this from the barn door one morning, arms folded across his chest, a faint ache settling somewhere he couldn't name. He waited until she laid Bennett down in the cradle Victor had built from pine boards and lambswool stuffing. Then he cleared his throat. Fence lines washed out, west of the creek. I could use another set of eyes. Lucinda pulled her shawl tighter and met his gaze. I'll ride with you. Victor nodded. We'll take the wagon. Let the boy sleep in the back. He's calmer outside anyhow. They packed a spare quilt and laid Bennett in a basket lined with flannel. Lucinda rode beside Victor, her hands steady on the sidewall of the wagon, her eyes scanning the tree line as they cut west, the path still soft from spring rain. By the time they reached the creek, the sun had crested behind them, casting long shadows over the field. The fence had held in some places, but several posts had tipped toward the water, and two rails were missing entirely. Victor stepped down and tested the ground with his boot. Flood came up higher than I thought. Lucinda climbed down after him, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You've got spare rails? In the barn. We'll mark what needs hauling. She knelt beside one of the leaning posts, her fingers tracing a deep gouge in the wood. This was cut. Victor moved beside her, crouching. That's no flood. Someone came through here. Lucinda's hand stilled. You think they were looking for us? He didn't answer right away. He stood slowly, eyes fixed on the trees beyond the creek. Could be trappers. Could be someone passing through. But they weren't careful. Left tracks. Lucinda rose, brushing her skirt clean. What do we do? Victor turned to her. We mend what we can, stay watchful. If they were headed this way, they'd have made it by now. She nodded, but her fingers closed into her palm. They worked in silence, marking sections and measuring with lengths of twine. When they'd finished, Victor climbed into the wagon bed and checked the baby. Bennett slept on, his breath warm against the edge of the basket. Lucinda climbed up beside him, settling across from the cradle. You ever use a rifle? Victor glanced at her. Yes. I never did. My father wouldn't allow it. Said it made a woman hard. Victor's expression didn't change. You want me to teach you? Lucinda looked out across the field. I don't want to be hard, but I want to be ready. He nodded. We'll start tomorrow. When they returned to the homestead, the sun had dipped low. Lucinda carried Bennett inside while Victor unhitched the team. His hands worked with practiced rhythm, but his mind was elsewhere. Inside, Lucinda laid the baby down and lit the lamp. The windows glowed soft against the darkening sky. Victor came in a few minutes later, dust clinging to his boots. I've been thinking, she said without turning. He stepped closer, waiting. Lucinda looked at the cradle, then at him. I want to make this ours. Victor's brow furrowed. It already is. No, she said gently. I mean more than surviving. I want to build something here. Plant roots that won't rip out when the wind comes. Victor was quiet, then stepped forward and took her hand. Then let's do it proper. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything, he said. I want you beside me, not just under my roof. Lucinda searched his face. I won't be an easy woman, Victor. Carry things. And the world's already judged me more than once. He brought her hand to his chest. Let them judge. I'll be too busy loving you to notice. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. Then say it plain. I want to marry you, Victor said. Not for duty, not for the boy, for you. Because you walked through a storm and still found your way here. Lucinda let out a long, shaking breath. Then yes, I'll be your wife. They stood there in the quiet, hands clasped, the fire crackling low beside them. Outside, the wind had stilled. The night held its breath, as if even the land knew something had been made whole. The wedding took place on a Saturday, under a cottonwood that had stood longer than any man living. Victor fashioned a ring from a silver coin he'd flattened and filed with care, and Lucinda wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin left behind in a trunk by Victor's mother. It had taken her 3 days to alter it, her stitches small and certain, her hands steadier now than they'd been in months. They exchanged vows with the preacher from the valley, an old man with a voice like dry leaves and the smell of pipe smoke in his coat. He rode up with a Bible in one hand and a tin of black tea in the other, offering both with equal solemnity. Lucinda held Bennett in her arms as they stood before the preacher. The baby's eyes were open, calm, as if he too understood the weight of the moment. Victor's hand found hers, warm and sure, and when the preacher asked him if he took this woman, he didn't hesitate. I do, with everything I have. Lucinda met his gaze when it was her turn. I do, and I won't run from it. The preacher nodded once, satisfied, and closed the Bible. Then you're married in the eyes of God and all that's good. Victor kissed her then, slow and soft, with no one around but the cottonwood and the wind. Lucinda leaned into it, her free hand resting against his chest, and for the first time in years, she felt like nothing needed guarding. That evening, Victor brought out a fiddle he'd kept wrapped in oilskin near the hearth. It wasn't much, a little warped in the neck and missing a string, but it held tune well enough. He played a tune from his childhood, a quiet, loping melody that seemed to roll with the hills behind the house. Lucinda watched him from the doorway, swaying gently as she bounced Bennett in her arms. The baby had fallen asleep again, his mouth slack against her collar. She didn't sing, but she hummed under her breath, her voice barely there. When the music faded, Victor set the fiddle down and looked at her. "I never thought I'd play that tune for anyone but myself." She smiled, tired but content. "You think he'll remember it?" Victor nodded toward the cradle. "He'll learn it. Even if he forgets, we'll play it again." Later, while the fire died low and the lamp cast soft light across the room, Lucinda stitched a new cloth for the cradle. It was plain linen, but she embroidered a row of tiny branches along the edge. Victor sat beside her, polishing the scuffed toe of his boot with a square of flannel. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked, not looking up. "Once," he said. "Back when it felt like I was standing still while the world moved on. But now? No, not anymore." Lucinda's needle paused. "Why not?" He looked at her, his eyes steady. "Because everything I ever wanted's here now, and I've got no use for anything else." She nodded slowly. "I used to dream about San Francisco. Big windows, trains that went to the ocean. But I think that was just me trying to chase someplace I wouldn't feel small." "You don't look small from where I'm sitting," Victor said. Lucinda folded the cloth and set it down. "Then maybe I'm finally seeing myself clear." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the sky stretched wide and clean above the hills. After a while, Lucinda stood and crossed to the cradle. She laid the cloth inside, smoothing it with her fingertips. Then she turned and reached for Victor's hand. "Come to bed," she said. He followed her without speaking, the floorboards creaking soft under their steps. They left the lamp burning low in the corner, casting gold across the walls. That night, with her hand resting against his chest, Lucinda whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." Victor brushed a kiss to her temple. "You never had to be." And when they fell asleep, it was with their fingers twined together, the sound of Bennett's even breath in the quiet, and the knowledge that whatever had come before, it was behind them now. They were home, together, whole. June brought a hush to the hills, the kind that settled into the tall grass and waited. The days warmed, stretching long between morning chores and the hush of twilight. Lucinda kept her skirt pinned high around her boots, planting carrots and beans in the garden rows Victor had widened with her help. Bennett was laid in a sling of linen fastened to a crossbar between two trees, where the breeze could find him and the bees kept their distance. His eyes followed the sky now, tracking the movement of clouds, and sometimes when Lucinda leaned close, he reached up and brushed her chin with a damp hand. Victor had built a smokehouse near the barn, and the first strips of venison hung curing inside. He was teaching Lucinda how much salt to pack into the crevices, how to keep watch for flies. She learned fast, not out of fear, but because the days had become hers too. One morning, she came into the barn while Victor was oiling the harness. Her hands were stained with green from pulling weeds, and there was a ribbon in her hair she hadn't worn before. He noticed it but didn't speak of it. "I found a patch of wild mint along the far ridge," she said, brushing dirt from her palms. "If we boil it with the elderberries, it could help when the baby teething starts." Victor nodded, testing the buckle at the collar strap. "You think of everything." Lucinda leaned against the stall gate. I used to think surviving meant just keeping breath in your lungs. Now it feels like it means more. Victor set the harness aside and crossed to her. It does. You're building something now. That changes the meaning of things. She looked up at him. Do you ever think about what kind of man your father was? Victor paused, then nodded. I think about him when I'm repairing tools. He wasn't warm, but he taught me to fix what breaks, even if it takes time. Lucinda reached for his hand. You've been repairing more than fence wire, Victor. He held her gaze, then kissed the back of her fingers. So have you. That night, as the sun dipped low and the chickens settled into their roosts, Lucinda took the sewing basket off the shelf and opened a folded piece of paper. She'd been working when she could, sketching out a simple dress pattern for Bennett's first birthday. Though it was months off, she wasn't used to thinking that far ahead, but it steadied her hands. Victor sat beside her, sharpening the knife he used for splitting kindling. He paused when the blade caught the lamplight just so. I've been wondering if we ought to take a trip down to town next week, he said. There's a woman there, Mrs. Redman. She's got a printing press. Might be time to get the boy's birth recorded. Lucinda looked up. Do you think it matters? I think it will to him someday. Knowing he was born into a name, into a family. She folded the pattern carefully. Then yes, let's go. The trip into Laramie took most of the day. They left before light fully crested the ridge, with Bennett wrapped close to Lucinda's chest and a basket of eggs tucked under the seat to trade. Victor handled the reins while she kept one hand on the boy, whose eyes blinked open every so often with a curious, unbothered look. When they reached the town's edge, Lucinda shifted in her seat. It's smaller than I remembered. Most things are when you come back taller, Victor said. They visited the print shop first. Mrs. Redman was a sturdy woman with sharp eyes and an ink-stained apron. She took down the child's name and date, then asked gently whose name to list as father. Victor didn't hesitate. Mine. Lucinda's eyes flicked to him, but she said nothing until they were outside again, walking along the boardwalk past the feed store. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly, adjusting the blanket around Bennett. Victor stopped. He's mine in every way that counts. I'll never see him as anything else. She stepped close. You do that, you say something like that, and I wonder how I ever lived without you. Victor touched her cheek, his thumb brushing just under her eye. You won't have to wonder again. They stopped at the general store for flour and barley, and Lucinda picked out a bolt of blue calico, not for herself but for curtains. Something about the house had started to feel more permanent, and she wanted to mark it with color. Back at the homestead, they put the baby to sleep and sat on the porch, their chairs angled toward the field that fanned out wide and green beneath the moon. Lucinda rested her bare feet on the rail, her head tilted toward the stars. Do you think we'll grow old here? She asked, voice low. Victor leaned forward, elbows on his knees. If we're lucky, and if we don't, it won't be for lack of trying. She smiled, then turned to him. You know what I want? More than anything? He looked at her, waiting. I want to live slow. I want mornings like this one, and evenings where we don't say much, but everything's understood. I want the kind of life that leaves a mark without shouting. Victor reached for her hand. Then that's what we'll build. Day by day. She leaned over and kissed him, not out of habit but because she could, because it felt like the right punctuation to the day. And when she rested her head against his shoulder, they stayed like that until the lantern burned out inside, and the world quieted around them. Years passed like the slow unfurling of spring. Bennett grew strong and curious, full of questions that Victor answered in the barn, and Lucinda softened with stories by the stove. Together they built a second room onto the house, planted fruit trees that bore by the 4th year, and taught their son to write his name in the dirt before he learned to sign it on paper. Lucinda kept the calico curtains up through every season, replacing the thread when it wore thin, never changing the color. Victor carved a rocker for her when she was carrying their second child, a girl born as autumn settled gold across the field. They named her Cora, and she came into the world with a cry that sounded like wind through pine. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucinda found the ribbon she'd worn that first summer and tied it around a jar of blackberry preserves. She left it on the table for Victor without a word. He found it after morning chores and carried it to her where she stood in the garden, her hands deep in the tomato vines. "I remember this," he said, holding it up. Lucinda turned, brushing her forehead with the back of her wrist. "So do I." He set it down beside her basket. "I'd marry you again today if I could." She smiled. "You do. Every day you come home." Victor kissed her there in the garden, the sun warm on their backs, the wind stirring the trees like it had when she first walked into his life. And he knew without need for words that he would carry this woman and their life together through every season still to come. They had built something lasting, not loud, not famous, just honest, just real, and they never had to run again,